The Dreamcast came out in 1999 in North America, 1998 in Japan. That system unfortunately didn't last as long as many of us Sega fans wanted it to. But playing it today has given me a sort of nostalgic feeling, but a great appreciation for the system. You see, I recently modified one of my Dreamcasts to be able to play off SD card and put it on my HD TV for today to play it and enjoy it. Now, what I found when playing a lot of these classic games is that the Dreamcast still looks good in 2025. Now, the Dreamcast lost the console wars, obviously, and I wanted to kind of pay homage to it, but at the same time, many of us know that Xbox and PS2 were great systems that were in that same console generation, but many felt, well, you're probably better off with PS2 or Xbox when it comes to graphics. But how do they hold up in 2025? I'm taking a look at a few games. Now, the internet has a lot of comparisons with like the same games between Dreamcast and PlayStation 2, but I want to do something different. In this video, I'm going to compare Dreamcast games to games that came out later in the console cycle. So just a couple for PS2 and even one for Xbox that came out after Sega was done, to compare the graphics and actually see which holds up better, PS2, Xbox, or the good old Dreamcast. If you're new to this channel, I like to talk about nostalgic games and games that come back to life, so if you like the type of stuff, definitely consider subscribing. I'm a Shenmue fan, I'm a Sega fan. If you're a Sega or Shenmue fan, or both, subscribe. You'll get plenty of good content. Now let's get started. Now the first thing I want to do is compare a lot of these Dreamcast games to similar games that came out, specifically mostly on the PS2, because PS2 was really comparable when it came to the Dreamcast. And the first game I'm going to start off with is actually the NFL 2K series. So I'm comparing NFL 2K3 to Dreamcast NFL 2K2. And I wanted to see, what are the graphical differences? Now, there's one major difference between NFL 2K2 versus NFL 2K3. That being, when NFL 2K3 came out for the PS2, they had an ESPN license, which made them have all of the branding of ESPN, which added a little bit of creative value to the games. Now, if you compare both side by side, there's something very evident. Both really have a polygonal look. Now, I will say that the Dreamcast version, they look a little bit more blocky than they did in the PlayStation 2 version. But then there's another strong difference. Both play relatively very similar. Both of them look graphically similar. However, there's a lot of aliasing on the PlayStation 2. If you look at the green on the turf, you could see a lot of shimmering artifacts on the PlayStation 2, where the turf on the Dreamcast is a little bit more blurred out, but if it's closer, it looks kind of smooth. And that is something that I really caught out and really noticed, and I'm like, wait a minute, the Dreamcast, though a little bit blurrier than the PS2, PS2 is actually very sharp in this comparison. You'll notice that the PlayStation doesn't look as good as the Dreamcast version because all that shimmering is a little bit of a distraction. Now, you still get a lot of detail on the PlayStation 2 version, but the Dreamcast version actually looks pretty good. And for reference, I played the Dreamcast version on actual hardware. So I connected an HDMI to my Dreamcast, and it didn't have any up-resing effects or anything like that. It's literally just a cable that converts the signal to HDMI. And because the Dreamcast had VGA output capabilities, you could actually get really sharp looking video off of the Dreamcast that you couldn't normally get off of competing consoles at the time of release. Now, the PlayStation 2 footage, I will say that I wanted to be as even as possible, but try to give it a fair comparison to play the games in modern day. So I hooked up my PlayStation 3 to use the HDMI connection from the PlayStation 3 to my computer so I can get something similar, because the PlayStation 3, the original fat PlayStation 3, had an emotion engine in it and could play all PS2 games. So I hooked it up, connected it, started going, and my PS3 overheated. In fact, after that initial trial, I can't get the PS3 to stay on more than a few minutes before it shuts down again. So I'm gonna have to do something about that. Because of this, I had to settle for emulation. Now the ups and downs about that is that emulation, I looked at the footage and I compared it to the footage when I had the PS3 running, and it was very similar, almost exact. But should there be any artifacts that appear in PlayStation 2 footage when I record, that would be the result of imperfect emulation, which happens. But for the most part, you're going to get a look of what it would have been like if you hooked up the PlayStation 3 with PlayStation 2 hardware built in via HDMI. So it's not that bad. So as far as NFL 2K3 versus NFL 2K2 on the Dreamcast, I would say I prefer the Dreamcast look a lot better, but I do enjoy the upgraded effects that the NFL 2K3 game has. Either is not a bad choice, but honestly, the shimmering did bother me enough to prefer the Dreamcast version. So I think Dreamcast in this case holds up better than the PlayStation 2 version. Moving on. The next comparison is Soul Calibur for the Dreamcast that came out on launch day versus Soul Calibur 2 for the PlayStation 2. Now, the original Soul Calibur did not come out on the PlayStation 2, but after some time, developers were able to recognize what it's like to work with the Emotion Engine on the PlayStation 2 and get familiar with the hardware before they put out Soul Calibur 2. And I believe Soul Calibur 2 came out around 2003, so that was years after the PlayStation 2 was released. So they should be familiar with the hardware, right? Well, when comparing Soul Calibur versus Soul Calibur 2, both of them run at a smooth 60 frames per second. Things that I like about the PlayStation 2 version of Soul Calibur 2 is the fact that the backgrounds themselves look a lot more detailed than the backgrounds of the Dreamcast version. And I will say that they're a little bit more interactive. It's not such stage that's a platform and then distant backgrounds like the Dreamcast version of Soul Calibur was. So that I do enjoy. And the details on the characters actually look pretty good. However, I will say that Soul Calibur on the Dreamcast has better lighting effects and it's a lot smoother, meaning that you don't have, like what happened before, the aliasing effects and the shimmering that happens in the stages and with the characters on the PlayStation 2. Which one's better to look at? Honestly, I would still favor the Dreamcast because the Dreamcast is not only nice to look at but nice to play. PlayStation 2 version of Soul Calibur 2 has so much of those shimmering artifacts that it looks like it's aged. It almost looks like, okay, this is not high quality, where because of the anti-aliasing activated on the Dreamcast, you can play it on modern screens and it'll still look good and it still holds up pretty well. Whereas Soul Calibur 2 kind of loses its soul with a lot of that. Now, if you looked at the colors between the Dreamcast and the PlayStation 2, the reason that the Dreamcast seems to be very saturated was because I saturated the footage when recording it in post. Because normally when I'm using my recording on the computer, it comes out dark. Doesn't happen on my television, but I guess different things that play the source material might display what you have differently. So I up the saturation, I up the exposure, and it kind of looks like that. But it is what it is, and it's not the Dreamcast's fault. That's my fault. But as far as the detail, as far as the lighting effects, they weren't so subtle on the PlayStation 2, and they weren't on the Dreamcast. The Dreamcast did a very good job with the lighting effects. That's why that game holds up better. Am I a little biased? Sounds like I'm a little biased, but honestly, decide for yourself. It's up to you. Details, I will say, are still better in Soul Calibur 2 on the PS2. That I can't argue, but the shimmering and the distracting artifacts and the subpar lighting kind of did it in for me. And finally, we're going to compare Sonic Adventure 2 to two games, Sonic Heroes and Sonic Unleashed. Now, Sonic Heroes was a game that actually came out pretty much right after Sonic Adventure 2. This was the next game on the lineup. I'm going to show you footage from the PS2 and the Xbox, and I'm going to compare that to Sonic Adventure 2 when you look at the footage. Now, this was just a few years after the Dreamcast was discontinued, so Sonic Team was able to create their next foray into the Sonic series, and this was the first exclusively developed for multi-platform game, Sonic Heroes. Now, let's compare Sonic Heroes versus Sonic Adventure 2. First stages. Now, if you look at Sonic Adventure 2, it starts off high energy. When you look at the level City Escape, this is a classic level, but the first level in Sonic Heroes isn't so classic or so well known, but you're starting off great. But what's the first thing you notice between the PlayStation 2 version of Sonic Heroes versus Sonic Adventure 2? It's the frame rate. Check out the frame rate. The frame rate on Sonic Adventure 2 is 60 frames per second. The frame rate on Sonic Heroes for the PlayStation 2 is a measly 30 frames per second. I thought the PlayStation 2 was supposed to be more powerful, but it's not. And you still have the aliasing effect happening on PS2 version. When you compare that to what Sonic Adventure 2 looks like, I would say it's like night and day. And Sonic Adventure 2, even for its cutscenes, Sonic Adventure 2 did it all in engine, whereas Sonic Heroes started off with a pre-rendered cutscene in order to tell you the story before it started with the game. Now, there's a lot of fast-paced action happening here, and I'm not going to compare the gameplay. I just want to compare the graphical look. Now, there's a lot more detail when it comes to Sonic and his friends in the PlayStation 2 version, but you have a clean-looking, good detailed Sonic in Sonic Adventure 2. And I think when it comes to like the level layout and the way everything is presented and looks, I prefer Sonic Adventure 2, whereas there's some loss in detail. Even though there's a lot going on screen, the frame rate and just nothing really stands out. Everything looks really plain on the PlayStation 2 version of Sonic Heroes. Graphically, it's hard to look at. Whereas the Dreamcast, 60 frames per second, fun gameplay, it really stands up for today's crowd that expects something at least to have a high amount of detail. And Sonic Adventure 2 takes the cake. Now, let's move on to the Xbox version of Sonic Heroes. The frame rate is 60 frames per second. Yes, I had to use emulation for the Xbox version as well, because unfortunately, my Xbox version is not working either. What's up with these old consoles? My Dreamcast still holds up. The 60 frames per second on the Xbox version makes this gameplay a ton better. So graphically, there's less shimmering as well, so the detail looks really good. At this point, it's really hard to say which one holds up better. I think they both hold up. Xbox does a great job. Gameplay-wise, I still prefer Sonic Adventure 2. It seems like a lot of work was put in with the level design of Sonic Adventure 2 as opposed to Sonic Heroes, where the levels, although very complex and very different, are just seem to be pretty plain. Just nothing creative, nothing with purpose. It's just levels. Platforming, I guess. Which looks better? I still give it to Sonic Adventure 2 because of the layouts of the levels are a little bit more detailed and have more character. But they both hold up really well for modern days. So Xbox, you did a good job. Now, let's add another detail to this. Now, you would think that after many years of development on the PlayStation 2, that developers would have a handle on how to develop for the PlayStation 2. So I give you Sonic Unleashed. Sonic Unleashed came out for PlayStation 2, I believe around 2008. And at this time, you already had the following generation of consoles already available. At least the Sonic levels, where you're not like Monster Sonic, but regular Sonic, and these are pretty good. Actually have a good reputation. PlayStation 2 was pretty much out the door at the time, but when this was developed, it should have been okay. Going back, let's compare Sonic Adventure 2 to Sonic Unleashed. Now the cutscenes, again, pre-rendered when compared to Sonic Adventure 2, which is all in-house. The pre-rendered scenes of Sonic Unleashed are amazing, but they're pre-rendered, so it's not a decent graphical comparison, and because of the compression of the video, from today's standards, it's not really that impressive. But now let's go to the actual graphics of Sonic Unleashed versus Sonic Adventure 2. And oh my goodness, we're back to 30 frames per second. You would think that the PlayStation 2, being a quote-unquote more powerful piece of hardware, would be able to do 60 frames per second for Sonic Unleashed. No, not at all. Still does 30. In fact, it looks choppier. It looks less than 30 frames per second. And then when you look at the movements and his awkward character design, his quills stand out a lot more than they used to in Sonic Adventure 2. It looks kind of awkward. Check out this jumping animation as well. When you're looking at the jumping animation, in my opinion, it looks smoother and it looks more natural in Sonic Adventure 2 when compared to Sonic Unleashed for the PlayStation 2. And the backgrounds and the details just look smudged. It does not look like a modern game. Now obviously in next generation consoles, the game looks a ton better. But we're talking PlayStation 2, which was supposed to be more powerful than the Dreamcast. And the Dreamcast, on modern screens, for Sonic Adventure 2, looks and runs so much better than PlayStation 2, a game that came out in 2008. And the gameplay itself is so much better. So which one holds up better? Without a doubt, Sonic Adventure 2 on the Dreamcast is so much better than Sonic Unleashed on the PlayStation 2. Which makes no sense to me. There's literally an 8-year difference in development. Is it 8 or 7-year difference in release date, actually? And you have that situation. I don't get it. Makes no sense. But that's it. So far, Sega came out winning everything, and that's why I believe that the Dreamcast, especially when you hook it up via HDMI, still holds up in 2025, even when compared to games that came out after it, and people still play today. So what do you guys think? You saw the comparisons. Would you agree? What games would have been better for comparisons? Now, I just tried to choose games that were similar that came out on both systems, but you guys let me know in the comments down below. Thank you. It's Magnus, and I'm out. See you guys next time.